All right, you guys, welcome to chapter 14 in the peripheral nervous system. So this is going to be another long lecture. So of course, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system are really the crux of the nervous system. So they're long chapters, but I really kind of pare it down to what I want you to know from those chapters. So again, if you want to watch this video a little split up, that's fine. Take some breaks in between, right? So what we're talking about today is the peripheral nervous system. So we want to talk about how the peripheral nervous system is organized. And we've covered a little bit about that. We've talked a little bit about spinal nerve roots. And so we'll just continue on from there. And then first we'll talk about sensory receptors. So kind of the sensory side of the peripheral nervous system and what different kinds of receptors we have in the body. We've talked about a couple of them in the integumentary system already, which is very helpful. And then we're going to talk specifically about the different cranial nerves. So we've got 12 cranial nerves and we'll cover each of them. And so that'll take a little bit of time. And then we'll cover the spinal nerves. And obviously there are a ton of spinal nerves, but I'll just break it down to the ones I want you to know, and it'll really help because now we know the muscles that these spinal nerves are going to innervate, which is great. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about disorders and development. So this should be a little bit of review. So the organization of the peripheral nervous system, we know that it's functionally divided into sensory and motor divisions, right? So we have sensory inputs and motor outputs. And then when we talk about those can even be subdivided into somatic, meaning kind of outside, right? And then visceral, meaning inside. So we discussed the differences between somatic, sensory, somatic motor, visceral, sensory, visceral motor in our first lecture of the nervous system. So just a little review about that. And then we can also talk about general versus special senses. Okay. And when we talk about the peripheral nervous system as a whole, it's really a communication system to the central nervous system. So it's receiving information from either outside the body or inside the body and sending it to the central nervous system. And then it also initiates any sort of action that the central nervous system tells it to do. So here's just that graph that or table we looked at in the first lecture and how we divided sensory and motor into somatic and visceral. And so just a reminder about the visceral motor, that's the autonomic nervous system. So we'll have a whole lecture on the autonomic nervous system by itself. So we're not going to talk too much about that today. We're going to talk more about sensory coming in and some of the peripheral nerves of the body as well. So hopefully this is a little review as well. So we have our sensory division, which is made up of receptors picking up the stimuli from either inside or outside the body. And then the motor division has these motor endings or motor end plates, which essentially are going to be those axon terminals of the motor neurons. And they're going to innervate effectors. So what are effectors? Well, that's going to be muscles or glands or organs, right? So they're going to innervate those effector muscles or organs. And then we talked a little bit about nerves and ganglia in the first lecture as well. And nerves are just bundles of peripheral axons. So remember we said all the cell bodies live in the central nervous system except the sensory neurons, and they live in the ganglia. Right? So the ganglia are those little clusters of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So we'll talk a lot more about ganglia over the next few lectures. But remember, nerves are bundles of axons, not just singular neurons. So now let's talk a little bit about sensory receptors and how we classify them. So we can classify them according to location. So where are they in the body? What type of stimulus do they pick up on? Is it touch? Is it heat? Is it pain? All those different kinds. And then also what kind of a structure do they have? So we'll talk about these different classifications of sensory receptors. So first we can classify them by location. So there's three kind of different types of locations in the body. So first you can say we're detecting something from outside the body or kind of somatic, and that's going to be exteroceptors. So they're located somewhere kind of near the body surface. Okay, and these guys, all of them, some may do touch, some may do pain or temperature, but they're all located near the body's surface, so they're called exteroceptors. And then the next type is stimuli from the internal viscera or organs, so they're interoceptors. So these guys are going to be in the digestive tract, the bladder or urinary tract, the lungs, and they're also going to detect a variety of different stimuli, such as chemical changes, taste, right? Stretching in the viscera when you have like gas distension, temperature as well. So again, these guys are detecting different stimuli, and so that's another classification we'll talk about. And then last but not least, we have proprioceptors, and these guys are very specific to the musculoskeletal system, and they are located in the muscles, tendons, joints, and ligaments, and they're going to monitor stretch and essentially tell you about body movement. Where is your body in space? How much is that tendon or muscle stretching? So you know exactly what your limbs and body are doing, okay? So we can also classify them by the stimulus that is detected. So that is, what are they picking up on? What is that sensory stimulus? So the first and probably one of the biggest classes of receptors are mechanoreceptors. So they're picking up on mechanical forces. So touch, pressure, stretch, vibration, itching, all those guys. Baroreceptors are a very specific type of mechanoreceptor that picks up on blood pressure. So we also have thermoreceptors. These guys are the ones that pick up temperature changes, right? So it's like thermoregulation, thermo, right, meaning heat. And then we have chemoreceptors. So chemo, think chemical. So these guys are responding to chemical changes or changes in the concentrations in different solutions of the body. So a lot of them are found in the blood, right? So detecting the chemical concentrations in our blood. Okay? And then photoreceptors are very specific, and they're only located in the eye. So these guys respond to light, right? So photoreceptors pick up on the light in the back of the eye, and that's what is going to help us to see, right? So we'll talk all about the different types of photoreceptors as well when we talk about the special senses and we talk about the eye. Now this one has a weird name, and this is the nociceptors, and their response is to painful stimuli. So nociceptors very specifically pick up on pain, okay? And there are people out there that can't feel pain, and so whether that has to do with their specific nociceptors of their body or if it's in the central nervous system, I think it's specific to what their disorder is, or if it's an injury or something like that. But these guys are very specific to just painful stimuli. So our next type of classification is by structure. So these are the general sensory receptors, and they can be divided into kind of two big structural groups. And those are the free nerve endings and encapsulated nerve endings. So free nerve endings, just think, the nerve axon terminates and it's going to just be in the environment of whatever tissue it's in. Whereas encapsulated nerve endings are going to have something wrapped around that axon terminal, okay? So we have a lot of free nerve endings in epithelia and the underlying connective tissue. And these guys can respond to multiple different types of stimuli. So there are some nociceptors, some mechanoreceptors, some thermoreceptors. All those guys can be these free nerve endings, okay? And then our encapsulated nerve endings means that it's going to be enclosed in some sort of connective tissue, okay? And these guys are all mechanoreceptors, so they're all going to pick up on, stretch, touch, pressure, itch, all that good stuff. So we've already talked about two of the types when we were talking about the integumentary system, and hopefully they ring a little bit of a bell, and that's the tactile corpuscle or Meissner corpuscle and the lamellar corpuscle or Pacinian. So those two are ones we've already talked about, but then we also have these ones called bulbous corpuscles or Ruffini endings. They're kind of a weird name. And they're similar to our other two types. And then we also have proprioceptors. So we said proprioceptors are all found in the musculoskeletal system. So all in the muscles, the tendons, and the joints. And so these guys are all mechanoreceptors. They're all found in that system, but they all are encapsulated. So they've got some sort of connective tissue wrapped around the ends of the nerve fibers, okay? So let's talk a little bit about those free nerve endings. So there's kind of two specialized types of free nerve endings. So most of them, are just free in the tissue, but we do have two types that are kind of specialized. And the first type is called the epithelial tactile complex or a Merkel disc. And they essentially kind of sit right under the basal layer of the epidermis. And they essentially pick up on very light touch. So they're similar to the tactile corpuscle in terms of where they sit, but they're considered a free nerve ending because they're not wrapped in connective tissue. Okay, so those are the Merkel discs, and they're found up in under the epidermis. And then we do have hair follicle receptors that are very specific, and they wrap around the hair follicles. So they're pretty rapidly adapting receptors to hair movement, right? So that's how you can feel if somebody brushes the hair on your skin, right? So you're able to feel that, and if you specifically just do one hair, you can feel it. You're not actually touching the skin, right? Because obviously the skin has its own sensory receptors, but again, the hair follicle itself has some receptors as well wrapped around that bulb of the follicle. So I think this table is pretty good in terms of summing up all of our kind of free nerve endings for our sensory receptors. So the first category are just those free nerve endings. It shows where they're located, what type of stimulus they can pick up on. So those are just those the classic free nerve endings. And then we just talked about our two kind of modified free nerve endings, and that's the Merkel disc as well as the hair follicle receptor. And they're very specific in terms of where they live and what they pick up on, versus the free nerve endings are a little more broad category of kind of what they pick up on, and they're found all over the body, right? So now we'll go through those encapsulated nerve endings. So the first two we've already talked about, so they should be a little bit of a review. So first is that tactile corpuscle, and essentially it's in those dermal papillae, which are sitting kind of up under the epidermis, right? And how they are encapsulated is actually by a Schwann cell. So now we know what a Schwann cell is and a myelin sheath. They essentially have a myelin sheath wrapped around that nerve ending by those Schwann cells, okay? These guys are rapidly adapting and they pick up on that light pressure. So they're located in this very sensitive, hairless areas of the skin. So we've seen lamellar corpuscles as well before. So these guys are also wrapped by Schwann cells, but they're more like a flattened layering of Schwann cells. So it just looks a little bit different. And they're deeper in the skin. So they're in the dermis and hypodermis. And therefore they're sensitive to the deep pressure, not the light pressure like our tactile corpuscles and those Merkel discs. And then our third and new kind are the bulbous corpuscles, and they are also located in the dermis, about the same area as those lamellar corpuscles, but they respond to slightly different pressure. So it's more of a continuous pressure on the skin instead of the just deep pressure. So again, it's a little bit different, but they're very similar to the lamellar corpuscles. So here's another table that really breaks down our encapsulated sensory receptors to show you just kind of where they are located, what kind of stimuli they pick up on, and where in the body they're found. So again, you can kind of see the differences between them here. So our last type are the proprioceptors. So these guys are encapsulated nerve endings. They're all mechanoreceptors, so they all are going to monitor stretch, but they're found in the muscle, the tendons, and the joints. So again, you don't need to know, the very specific places and what they're called, like the muscle spindles, the tendon organ. Just know the three main locations of where these proprioceptors are found and what they monitor. So we know that they're going to monitor stretch, right, within the muscle and the tendon, tension, joint capsule stretch, right? So it tells us what our body is doing and where it is in space, okay? So now let's talk about the cranial nerves. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on the cranial nerves, but I want you guys to do your own research as well. So I want you guys to know the names of the cranial nerves and what they do and what they innervate, okay? So all of these guys really attach to the brain. So they kind of all are going to come from some part of the brain, and then they're going to pass through a hole in the skull. And we learned a lot of these foramina, or the holes, and now they'll make a little bit more sense because we know, okay, that cranial nerve goes through that hole. So we have 12 cranial nerves, and 1 and 2, cranial nerve 1 and 2, attach to the forebrain. So they're the only ones that do not come off the brain stem. So all the other ones are going to either attach to or are near the brain stem. And they all are going to really serve the head and neck. So they're all going to innervate head and neck structures except one. So the vagus nerve is very special because not only does it innervate structures in the head, but it also extends to the abdomen. So it's a very long nerve, and it actually innervates a lot of our organs in the abdomen. So it's pretty crazy how long it is. So that's the only cranial nerve that goes somewhere other than the head and neck. So we're going to work our way through. We may not go in the exact order of the cranial nerves, but I'm going to group them together a little bit with what they do and what their functions are. So cranial nerve 1 and 2 are the olfactory nerves and the optic nerves. So olfactory is smell, right? And it's a special visceral sense. And so these guys are going to pick up on smell. So it's actually located in the epithelium of the nasal cavity. So there's sensory receptors that come down and they're chemoreceptors and pick up on the dissolved particles in the nasal mucosa. And then they actually pass through the cribriform plate, through the ethmoid bone, and go back to the forebrain. So again, this is one of them that's not attached to the brainstem. And then the optic nerve, right, is a special somatic sense for vision, and they originate in the retina or the back of the eye, and they're going to pass through those optic canals. So if remember, we had kind of two holes in the back of the eye. We had an orbital fissure and an optic canal, and so this is where the optic nerve runs through that sphenoid bone. So for all the cranial nerves, I'm going to include these tables from your book, and they have a little bit more detail on kind of where the nerve runs, what structures they pass through in the skull, and what that kind of looks like. And so you can kind of work through these tables on your own for each of these cranial nerves. But again, whatever I've kind of talked about and written about is the most important stuff you need to know about the cranial nerves. And so this is the olfactory nerve, okay? Here's the optic nerve. So it shows how it goes through the optic chiasm. So we started talking a little bit about the optic chiasm and how it crosses over a little bit. So we'll talk a little bit more about vision and why we have crossing over of the vision. Essentially, it's for depth perception, but we'll talk a lot more about some of these special senses in the other lecture. Okay, and so again, we said that most of our sensory information has to go through the thalamus. So can anyone guess which sense does not go through the thalamus? It was olfactory. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the special senses, but just as an FYI and just for an interest is that the olfactory or smell does not go through the thalamus, but all the other senses do, okay? So it has to go through the thalamus before it goes back to that visual cortex. So now we're going to kind of group these nerves together and call them all nerves of eye movement, okay? So we're going to skip a nerve here. So we're going to skip cranial nerve 5, but we're going to go cranial nerve 3, which is oculomotor, cranial nerve 4, trochlear, and cranial nerve 6, abducens. So these guys are all going to innervate the muscles of the eye and allow for eye movement. So the oculomotor nerve is going to really do most of the movement because, you know, the name oculomotor, movement of the eye. So it does the up, down, and in movements, and it's going to also constrict our pupil. Okay. Now, trochlear nerve does down and out, which is one specific movement. And we'll talk a little bit more about these eye movements when we talk about the muscles of the eye in our special senses lecture. So again, just kind of be more familiar with the three muscles that move the eye and not necessarily what they innervate specifically just yet. And last but not least, the abducens nerve, which is lateral movement of the eye. So all these together are all going to create all of our eye movements. So let's go through each of these cranial nerves individually to get a little bit more information. But again, don't worry too much specifically about the muscles they innervate just yet. Just know that they're doing the eye movements. So these guys, so this oculomotor nerve, so cranial nerve 3, has a couple different functions. So it definitely has a somatic motor function, and so it's going to innervate 4 of our 6 eye muscles. So that's quite a lot. So that's what I said, that it does the majority of the eye movements. Okay, so upward, downward, and inward. But it does also have a visceral motor function. So what did we say visceral motor was? Autonomic. So it does have an autonomic nervous system function, and that's the constriction of the pupil and a little bit of the lens shape as well. Okay, and another thing is all of these nerves are going to pass through the orbital fissure in the back of the eye. So these guys, instead of going through that optic canal like the optic nerve, they're going to go through that orbital fissure and innervate the muscles in the back of the eye. So here's our oculomotor table. So you can see those different muscles that they're innervating, things like that. So again, don't get too caught up on the specific muscles just yet. Just know about what they're doing, okay? So cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve, so it just has somatic motor function, and it rotates the eye downward and outward, okay? So it only innervates one muscle, and it also passes through that superior orbital fissure. So here's our trochlear table to show you the nerve, the muscle that the nerve innervates. So our last eye motor nerve is the abducens, or cranial nerve 6, and it also only has somatic motor function, innervating just one muscle of the eye that allows you to rotate your eye laterally. And it also passes through that superior orbital fissure. So here's our last eye motor nerve, okay? Showing you kind of where they originate and where they innervate. Okay, so these guys are all coming off of the brain stem. So now we're going to group cranial nerve 5 and cranial nerve 7 together, and that's the trigeminal nerve and the facial nerve. So these guys both have something to do with facial sensation and facial motor function. So trigeminal nerve is all sensation to the face. Okay, so it's responsible for any sort of sensation to anywhere on the face, but it also has some motor function as well, and it innervates those muscles of mastication. So if anyone remembers those muscles of mastication, the temporalis and the masseter muscles, that's what the trigeminal nerve innervates. And then the facial nerve, okay, so a lot of people get trigeminal and facial nerve confused, but the facial nerve does all motor function to the face, so muscles of facial expression. So it's how you smile, how you blink, wiggle your nose, right? So all of those facial expression functions is what it's responsible for. So everything except mastication, okay? So let's first talk about the trigeminal nerve, or cranial nerve 5. It is the largest of our cranial nerves, and it's responsible for all sensation to the face. So there are 3 major divisions, and they kind of make sense to where they go, and so it covers all of our face with these 3 divisions. So the ophthalmic division, kind of think towards the eye and forehead, nasal cavity, all that good stuff. And then the maxillary division kind of goes to the cheek, the upper lip, lower eyelid, more of the nasal cavity, and kind of the palate and upper teeth. And then the mandibular division goes to the chin and the tongue and lower teeth. Okay. So we also have some motor function in the mandibular division. So it contains motor fibers that are going to those muscles of mastication, specifically those temporalis muscles and the masseter muscles. Also the pterygoids as well, but we didn't talk as much about them. So all of those muscles of mastication. So we actually have two tables for the trigeminal nerve from the book because it's such a large and important nerve. So this first one kind of shows you the tracks of those nerves and of those branches. So we have the three branches kind of going to the eye, the upper jaw, and lower jaw. So you can kind of think of it that way. And if you remember that mandibular foramen that we talked about, where the dentist is trying to numb, you can actually see that that is the part of the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve going into those tooth roots. And then here's the other picture from the trigeminal nerve, just to show you kind of the innervation of those muscles of mastication from that mandibular branch. So now we'll talk about the facial nerve. So this is cranial nerve 7. So when you think of the facial nerve, think facial expression. So we said it's really all the motor function of the face except for the muscles of mastication. But it does also have some sensory function as well. So it does innervate part of our taste buds on our tongue. So we'll talk again about taste in our special senses lecture, but this one does have one part of the taste bud innervation. And then our motor function, that's the big one, right? That we said somatic motor function, all voluntary movement of the face. And we have 5 branches of the facial nerve instead of just our 3 for the trigeminal nerve. And we also have a little bit of visceral motor function, so a little autonomic nervous system, and they innervate some of our lacrimal glands and salivary glands. So essentially what we do to make tears and saliva. Okay, so that's part of that autonomic nervous system because we don't have voluntary control over our lacrimal glands and salivary glands. Now, the way it enters is through the temporal bone and through that internal acoustic meatus. So our picture on the next slide will better illustrate that. So here's our first image for the facial nerve. Again, we've got 2 images for the facial nerve because we've got a lot going on. And the first picture is showing some of the autonomic function and sensory function of the facial nerve. So we've got it showing how it exits through that internal acoustic meatus, going out to some of the glands in the face and those taste buds. And then the second image of our facial nerve is actually showing the somatic motor function going to all these facial muscles to show you the different branches of the facial nerve. But again, we don't need to know all the specific branches of the facial nerve like I want you to know for the trigeminal nerve, even though they're fairly straightforward. But again, we don't need to know all of the branches. Just know that they're going out to the muscles of the face and facial expression, even going down to the neck as well. So that platysma, that superficial muscle of the neck, is part of our facial expressions. If you do like a grimace, you know that your neck kind of tenses and you can see those lines from the tension in the platysma. So again, it's all part of facial expression. So now let's talk about cranial nerve 8. It's one of my favorites, and it's the vestibulocochlear nerve. And essentially this guy is for hearing and equilibrium. So it is a special somatic sense, and it's actually 2 branches of the same nerve. So we have a vestibular branch that's going to your inner ear for sensing equilibrium and balance. And then we have the cochlear branch, which is going to the inner ear as well, but for hearing. And we're going to talk a lot more about this nerve when we talk about our special senses lecture. So this is going to also pass through that internal acoustic meatus into that temporal bone and the inner ear structures that are found there. So here's our picture for the vestibulocochlear nerve, showing kind of how the two branches separate and go to the two specific structures in the inner ear. So again, we'll talk a lot more about this nerve when we talk about the ear and those internal structures of the ear. So now on to cranial nerve 9. So this is glossopharyngeal, and a lot of people forget the functions of the glossopharyngeal, but it kind of gives you a hint in the name. So glosso is for tongue, and pharyngeal is for pharynx or your throat. So it has sensory and motor functions. So if we think about the tongue, it innervates some more of those taste buds of the tongue. So that's a special visceral sense. So we said the facial nerve innervates some of the taste buds, and the glossopharyngeal innervates some of the other taste buds. But it also has some general visceral sense as well. So the back of the throat, or that pharyngeal mucosa, actually picks up some sensory receptors back there. So how you can feel kind of the tickling in the back of your throat, which will kind of stimulate you to swallow. And it also has some interesting autonomic functions with some chemoreceptors and baroreceptors in the carotid artery, but don't worry as much about those functions, okay? And then our motor function. So essentially, it kind of goes along with the pharyngeal sensation, is it also innervates the muscles of the pharynx. So remember we talked about those pharyngeal muscles and how it helps us to swallow. So it actually elevates the pharynx when we swallow, okay? Again, we have a little more autonomic function as well, innervating some more salivary glands, but again, that's kind of, don't worry as much about that as well. So this one has a lot. It's kind of across the board, sensory and motor. But if you think about tongue and pharynx, it'll kind of give you a good idea of what it does. And it actually runs through the jugular foramen. So that's one of those big holes in the base of the skull. So here's our picture for the glossopharyngeal, so we can see how it can innervate those taste buds in the tongue, the parotid gland, which is one of our salivary glands, as well as those pharyngeal muscles and the mucosa of the pharynx. So again, it's going to sense stuff in the throat, and then it's going to innervate those muscles to swallow. And it's showing, these are the carotid arteries down here on the right hand side, which is what it's showing. It's picking up on some baroreceptors and chemoreceptors to kind of sense blood pressure and oxygenation in the blood. So it's kind of more of an autonomic function, right? So don't worry too much about that yet. All right, so one of our big players of the autonomic nervous system is cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. So we also said this guy is kind of the odd man out because it runs all the way to the abdomen. So even though it does innervate some stuff in the head and neck, it mostly innervates organs of the body. And so really think autonomic nervous system when you think of the vagus nerve. So we'll talk a lot more about the vagus nerve when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. So what are some sensory functions? So it has some general visceral sensory function to thoracic and abdominal organs. So when you can feel things happening in your organs, that's thanks to the vagus nerve. And then it does innervate some more taste buds. So we actually have 3 cranial nerves innervating taste buds. You wouldn't think taste buds were that important, would you? But they are. So they actually innervate some of the very far back taste buds all the way back on our epiglottis, which is part of the larynx. So we'll talk a little bit more about the epiglottis when we talk about the digestive and respiratory systems. And then our motor functions. So it does have some somatic motor function, even though we said mostly think visceral motor function, but it does innervate some of the skeletal muscles of the pharynx and larynx. So it kind of works together with that glossopharyngeal nerve for some of these pharyngeal muscles and laryngeal muscles for swallowing, as well as talking and things like that, right? So moving the larynx and your vocal cords as well, okay? The visceral motor functions is all the autonomic nervous system. So it's pretty much responsible for the entire parasympathetic nervous system. So we said that autonomic nervous system can be broken down into sympathetic and parasympathetic, fight or flight, rest and digest. So vagus nerve, parasympathetic, rest and digest, okay? And so we'll go more into that in much more detail in our autonomic nervous system lecture. But they also run through the jugular foramen. So the jugular foramen is quite a large hole, so it's got quite a few nerves running through it, as well as the jugular vein. So here's our picture for the vagus nerve. So again, it's mostly innervating all of our abdominal and thoracic organs for the parasympathetic system, but you can see it does have some innervation in the larynx and pharynx region of the neck, okay? So just really think, you know, all of our abdominal and thoracic organs rest and digest, okay? So now let's talk about cranial nerve 11. So a lot of people forget about this one as well. So this one is another kind of odd man out. So it innervates the muscles of the neck, so that trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles. So neck flexion, neck extension, that's what it is innervating. And it doesn't actually really arise from the brainstem. So this is one of the ones where it kind of breaks the rules because it's actually a couple of ventral rootlets coming more from the spinal cord through C1 to C5. And then what it does is it's an interesting pathway it has. So those spinal rootlets merge to kind of form this nerve. And it actually enters into the skull through the foramen magnum. And then it exits through the jugular foramen. So kind of an interesting pathway for this nerve to run. So here is our image for the accessory nerve, which is quite interesting. So you can really appreciate how it is formed by those spinal rootlets, and it merges to form the accessory nerve. And it kind of comes up through that foramen magnum, makes an immediate turn, and comes out the foramen, the jugular foramen, which is kind of interesting. And then it innervates those muscles of the neck. So last but not least is cranial nerve 12, and this one is also in the name, which is very helpful. I think people get glossopharyngeal and the hypoglossal confused. So cranial nerve 9 and cranial nerve 12. But this one, think glosso again for tongue, but hypoglossal kind of think below the tongue. So it innervates all the muscles of the tongue. So it's motor function of the tongue. So essentially all the intrinsic, which means inside the tongue, and extrinsic, which means outside the tongue. So essentially it exits through its own hole as well. We remember that little tiny hole, the hypoglossal canal, which was kind of on the sides of the foramen magnum. Well, that is the hypoglossal canal for the hypoglossal nerve. So here's our image for the hypoglossal nerve, and really it just goes straight to the tongue and it innervates all those intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the tongue. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the spinal nerves. So these guys are very numerous, right? So instead of 12 pairs of nerves, we're talking about 31 pairs of nerves. Now that's just a lot of nerves. So obviously we're not going to talk about all of them. There's thousands of nerve fibers, but they all connect to the spinal cord. And a big thing to keep in mind about the spinal nerves is that they're named for where they exit the vertebral column. Okay, so where they exit through those intervertebral foramina and not where they actually originate on the spinal cord. So, because when we're talking about some of these lower spinal nerves, such as the sacral nerves and the coccygeal nerves, these guys actually originate on the end of the spinal cord up in L1 and L2. So again, they come down through that cauda equina and extend down and then exit the vertebral column in those areas. Okay, so again, just pay attention to that and don't think that that's where the spinal cord is living, but the nerve is actually exiting in those areas of the vertebral column. So now let's talk about how the spinal nerves actually exit the spinal cord and exit the vertebral column. So they're going to connect via these spinal roots, right? So we said that we have a dorsal root and a ventral root, or if you like to think posterior and anterior roots. And we said that the dorsal root only contains sensory neurons or sensory fibers, and the ventral roots only contain motor fibers, right? And then they are going to merge together to form a spinal nerve, because all nerves are going to be motor and sensory. So then what happens is after they merge together to form the nerve, they actually split again. So the nerve is going to branch again into a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. So each of these rami, plural, have both sensory and motor neurons. So again, don't get confused between roots and rami. Okay, so roots are very specific, specific fibers, and then we have the rami that have both motor and sensory fibers. So where do these rami go? So when we're talking about the dorsal rami, think, the posterior side of the body. So they are going to innervate the back muscles. Okay, so they follow kind of a neat segmented pattern by where they kind of exit the vertebral column, and they're going to innervate a horizontal strip of muscle and skin along the back. Okay, so you can follow that dorsal ramus innervating those back muscles and out to the skin as well. So if the dorsal rami innervate the back, then the ventral rami is going to innervate the ventral muscles or anterior thoracic and abdominal wall muscles. So if we're at the level of the rib cage, the ventral rami are actually going to turn into intercostal nerves. And those intercostal nerves are going to supply all those intercostal muscles. Remember our internal and external intercostal muscles. And we also have those thoracic and abdominal wall muscles. So they're each going to give off these branches that are going to supply all of these muscles. But at the same time, just like the dorsal rami, they're also going to innervate the skin. So we do have a cutaneous branch that's going to innervate the skin as well. So now we're going to talk a little bit about nerve plexuses. And these are just networks of nerves. So we have 4 major nerve plexuses in the body, and they're going to primarily serve the limbs. Now, these guys are also going to come from the ventral rami, unless you're in that thoracic region. So if you're in the thoracic region, you're going to become an intercostal nerve if you're coming off the ventral rami. Or if you're anywhere else in the body, you're going to develop these one of these 4 nerve plexuses. So they branch, all of these ventral rami, and come together and form a nerve plexus. So this is just a great picture breaking down all the different spinal nerves. So on the right hand side, it shows you the different regions of the nerves coming off of the vertebral column. And then on the left-hand side, you have a breakdown of the plexuses, the enlargements, and the intercostal nerves. So if you're in the region of the thoracic nerves, you're going to become an intercostal nerve if you're a ventral ramus or rami. And then you have your 2 plexuses in the upper body, which is your cervical plexus and brachial plexus, kind of in the neck and shoulder region. And those are because of the nerves going to the upper limb mostly. Cervical plexus we'll talk a little bit about. It's a little bit different. And then we have the cervical enlargement because of all these large nerves running to the upper limb. And then same with the lower limb, we have 2 plexuses in the lower body that are going to the lower limb, and that's going to be the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus. And that lumbar enlargement is because of these plexi or plexuses, because we have so many large nerves going to the lower limbs. Okay. So let's start with the first nerve plexus, and that's the cervical plexus. So really it's kind of deep to the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and it's formed from the ventral rami of the first 4 cervical nerves, so C1 through C4. So again, that's where they exit the vertebral column, not where they're coming from on the spinal cord. So most of these guys are going to be cutaneous nerves. Some of them innervate some of the muscles of the neck. But the big one and kind of an interesting thing is the phrenic nerve comes from the cervical plexus. And I want you to know that, okay? So why is the phrenic nerve so important? Well, it innervates the diaphragm. And what did we say the diaphragm was important for? Breathing. Yep. So that's how we breathe. So the diaphragm is the main responsible muscle for breathing. So the phrenic nerve coming all the way from the cervical plexus is going to innervate the diaphragm. So now we have the brachial plexus. So first we covered the cervical plexus. Now we have the brachial plexus if we work our way down the vertebral column. And these guys, all of these nerves are going to innervate the upper limb. Okay, so all of these guys are going to give rise to all of the nerves that are going to innervate muscles of the upper limb. So we have 5 of these upper limb nerves that we care about. I'm not going to talk too much about some of the smaller branches, but we have the radial nerve, the axillary nerve, musculocutaneous nerve, median, and ulnar nerve. So again, from this picture, don't worry too much about the different trunks and divisions and the roots, all of that. Just notice how the plexus is formed by these ventral rami. So the ventral rami are going to come together and kind of merge into these separate larger nerves. Okay, so don't worry too much about that. Just notice that they're going to eventually become anterior and posterior nerves of the arm. So first, let's talk about the anterior nerve. So we have 3 on the anterior side and only 1 kind of on the posterior side. Well, 2, but 1 main one. So we have the musculocutaneous nerve, and this guy is going to innervate the biceps and brachialis. Okay, so the muscles that are going to flex the forearm at the elbow. And then the median nerve is going to innervate the muscles of the forearm and the lateral palm. So things that are going to flex the wrist and the digits. Okay. And then the ulnar nerve are also going to innervate muscles that flex and flex the wrist and digits, but it's more on the medial side instead of the lateral side. Okay, so it's going to run down the ulna. So the ulna is running medially, the radius is lateral. So the median nerve is kind of running down the middle and a little more lateral than the ulnar nerve. Okay. So I think this is just a great picture from your book that shows you the muscular innervation of these different nerves. So now that you know some of these muscles, you can really say, okay, oh, those are the flexors of the wrist and the digits, or oh, those are the flexors of the elbow, right? So you should be able to recognize some of these muscles that it's innervating. And then on the right hand side, don't worry too much about it, but essentially it's showing you the sensory areas or the cutaneous innervation. So where these nerves are going to pick up on sensation to the skin. Okay. So again, they're all nerves, so they have both sensory and motor functions, right? So now let's go through the posterior nerves of the upper limb. And the main one is really the radial nerve, but we have to talk about the axillary nerve as well because it innervates kind of the shoulder muscles. So really think deltoid and arm abduction, but also some of those rotator cuff muscles, such as the teres minor. And then the radial nerve is really the largest branch of the brachial plexus because it innervates the entire posterior side of the upper limb. So it's going to be all of the muscles that are going to extend the arm, the wrist, and the digits. Okay. So if we look at our picture again, the left side is showing all those muscles that the nerves are innervating, and then on the right hand side you're looking at the sensory areas that that nerve is going to pick up on. Okay. So the next 2 plexuses are the lower limb plexuses. So the first one is the lumbar plexus. So it's going to arise from L1 to L4, and again this is where the nerves are exiting the vertebral column. And we do have some smaller branches that are going to innervate part of the abdominal wall and that psoas muscle, which is part of that iliopsoas for hip flexion. Okay, but the main branches are going to innervate the anterior and medial thigh. Okay, so the femoral nerve is going to run down the anterior thigh. So this is for all those quadriceps muscles for leg extension at the knee. Okay, it also innervates the obturator nerve. Okay, and the obturator nerve is important for all of those adductor muscles of the medial thigh. Okay, so femoral, anterior, extension, obturator, medial, adduction. Okay. So here are the muscles that the 2 nerves innervate, as well as the cutaneous innervation and the sensory areas. Okay. Now the sacral plexus, so it's a little bit lower, it's going to arise from L4 to S4, so kind of the lower lumbar area and the sacrum. And a lot of times we talk about the lumbosacral plexus, so we kind of combine the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus together. So a lot of times we talk about them together, okay? So the sacral plexus innervates the lower limb as well. And we do have some first branches that are gluteal nerves that are going to innervate the gluteal muscles, kind of right at the beginning of the plexus. But then the major branch of the sacral plexus is the sciatic nerve. So the sciatic nerve is really important, and a lot of people have sciatic nerve pain, right? And it's the largest nerve in the body, actually. And it's actually two nerves in one sheath. So once it hits about the level of the knee, kind of right above the knee, it actually splits into these two nerves. So it splits into the tibial nerve, which innervates most of the posterior lower limb. And these are the flexors of the leg and the foot. Okay. And then the other one kind of curves and goes lateral and anterior, and that's the common fibular, or some people call it the peroneal nerve. And this innervates the kind of the anterior and lateral sides of the leg. So here is our image that really gives you a good idea of the two separate nerves that are running in the same sheath. And so we term it the sciatic nerve, but it really is the two nerves, the tibial and the common fibular. Okay, so these guys are innervating lots of muscles of the leg, and you can see some of the cutaneous or sensory areas on the right hand side as well. So these are just some images from cadavers that shows you a little bit what the nerve plexuses look like on the cadaver, but again, don't worry too much about it. Just to give you a real life kind of example of what these nerves look like. They kind of look like spaghetti to me. So finally, let's talk a little bit about disorders and development of the peripheral nervous system. So not too bad, we made it through. So a couple disorders we can talk about is one is shingles. So shingles is fairly common. It's actually from the childhood chickenpox virus. So it is a viral infection. And often it's brought on by stress in people over 50. So whether it has to be due to a weaker immune system as we age, but we do usually just see it in older people. And the virus essentially travels along the nerves to the skin. So where it affects the skin, we call those dermatomes. So remember we said that those intercostal nerves are sending out branches to the skin, right? So to the cutaneous level. And so they're kind of in these horizontal patterns because that's how our nerves and those intercostal nerves are coming out of the vertebral column. So it's really only affecting the skin that's innervated by that one nerve. So it's kind of interesting in why it makes that very distinct pattern on the skin. So then we have peripheral neuropathy, excuse me. So this can be fairly common as well, just depending on the cause. But essentially it can either affect sensory or motor involvement. So you can either have some decreased sensation or paresthesia, burning, pain as well in your peripheral nerves. A lot of times it's in the feet, or hands, so it's a lot of limbs affected. And then the cause can be anything from trauma to systemic disorders. We see it a lot in diabetic patients. as well as trauma. So something like a car accident or something like that. I know my mother-in-law has peripheral neuropathy and she can't feel her feet very well. So she was in a very bad car accident which damaged some nerves in her back down to her feet. So again, it can be many different causes, but you have either symptoms of sensory and or motor involvement, just depending on which part of the uh, nerve is affected. So the nervous system really develops quite early on, or the peripheral nervous system, I should say. And they form really kind of late in week 4, so that's very early on. And essentially all 31 pairs of those spinal nerves are developing. They're sending motor fibers to individual embryonic developments of the muscles called myotomes. And then they're also sending sensory fibers to all the overlying skin. And really by week 5, they've reached the organs that they're going to innervate as well. So what's really interesting is that the muscles and the skin will always retain their original nerve supply. So the nerves are really going to develop quite early on and continue through life. So here are our learning objectives for today. It wasn't quite too bad, not as long or as painful as the central nervous system. But again, I highly recommend making flashcards for all those cranial nerves. Hopefully the spinal nerves and the plexuses aren't too bad because we've already learned the muscles and a lot of them are named, for the muscles and bones where they're near, where they're running. So that helps us out a ton. So next week we're going to get into the special senses. So a little bit more detail on, taste, smell, sight, and hearing or sound. We've kind of done our general senses, right, fairly well. So we won't be talking about touch, but we will cover all those special senses. And here are some review questions then for the peripheral nervous system as well from your textbook. Okay, so if you have any questions, let me know. Hopefully I will see you guys in office hours. All right, until next time.